Donald Trump has been sent into a full-blown public meltdown by devastating legal news dropped on him by special counsel Jack Smith, and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video, but I want to give you a brief recap of the news itself, and then we'll go into Donald Trump's reaction and take it from there.
Special counsel Jack Smith has just filed a superseding indictment in the federal January 6th case. In a statement, the special counsel says, quote, "Today, a federal grand jury in the District of Columbia returned a superseding indictment charging the defendant with the same criminal offenses that were charged in the original indictment. The superseding indictment, which was presented to a new grand jury that had not previously heard evidence in this case, reflects the government's efforts to respect and implement the Supreme Court's holding and remand instructions."
So, for context, Jack Smith has effectively re-indicted Donald Trump on the January 6 Washington, D.C. case in front of Judge Tanya Chutkan. That case, like all the other Supreme Court cases or all of the other prosecutions against Donald Trump, with the exception of New York, were hit pretty hard by the Supreme Court ruling in Trump v. United States, which effectively gave sweeping presidential immunity, ridiculous, unpatriotic, un-American, absurd sweeping immunity to Donald Trump and all former presidents. So Jack Smith went back to the drawing board and he impaneled a new grand jury. So new people, new citizens seeing new evidence, not seeing old evidence that would not be prohibited because of the Supreme Court's decision, and with the same sort of instructions which reflect the Supreme Court's ridiculous, un-American, absurd ruling. So Jack Smith is effectively taking another shot at this and trying to color within the lines. Donald Trump did not handle it well. So he broke it down, his breakdown, into 4 parts on Truth Social. So he says, in an effort to resurrect a dead witch hunt in Washington, D.C. in an act of desperation and in order to save face, the illegally appointed special counsel, deranged Jack Smith, has brought a ridiculous new indictment against me, which has all the problems of the old indictment and should be dismissed immediately. His Florida document hoax has been completely dismissed. That was by the Trump-appointed district judge, Aileen Cannon, by the way. This is merely an attempt to interfere with the election and distract the American people from the catastrophes Kamala Harris has inflicted on our nation, like the border invasion, migrant crime, rampant inflation, the threat of World War III, and more. Obviously, there's a lot to debunk there, but you know what? We're just going to keep going. For them to do this immediately after our Supreme Court victory on immunity and more is shocking. I've also been informed by my attorneys that you're not even allowed to bring cases literally right before an election, a direct assault on democracy. This is an unprecedented abuse of the criminal justice system. This case has to do with, quote, conspiracy to obstruct the 2020 presidential election, when they're the ones who did the obstructing of the election, not me. They cheated on the election, and they go after me for cheating on the election. Interestingly, this comes at the exact same time as Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook has admitted to concealing massive amounts of information, such as Hunter Biden's laptop from hell, which is a direct acknowledgement that the 2020 election was manipulated and rigged by the DOJ. What they're doing now is the single greatest sabotage of our democracy in history. Again, he's having such a meltdown with this all caps, weirdly written nonsense that he had to break it down into multiple truths. This travesty is now on Comrade Kamala Harris, who is actively pushing it rather than immediately calling for its dismissal, as should be done. This is for third world countries and banana republics, not for the USA. As Jack Smith knows, the whole case should be thrown out and dismissed on presidential immunity grounds, as already ruled unequivocally by the U.S. Supreme Court. Smith rewrote the exact same case in an effort to circumvent the Supreme Court decision. The people of our country will see what's happening with all of these corrupt lawsuits against me and will reject them by giving me an overwhelming victory on November 5th for President of the United States. And you might be thinking, wow, that's a really good time to end this. But no, there's more. No presidential candidate or candidate for any office has ever had to put up with all this lawfare and weaponization directly out of the office of a political opponent. They've weaponized local DAs and attorney generals, it should be attorneys general, by the way, and anyone else that will listen to interfere with the upcoming 2024 presidential election. Never been done before. This is now Kamala's weaponized system against her political opponent. All of these scams will fail, just as deranged Jack's hoax in Florida has been fully dismissed, and we will win the most important election in the history of our country on November 5th. So that was a lot. And again, if we Donald Trump basically lied in every sentence. So if we spent the time fact checking him on everything, this would be a 4-hour video. So just a couple of things. Yes, it was. Donald Trump says all the time that he won the case in Florida. He didn't win it. It was dismissed by a Trump appointed district judge who had previously demonstrated bias towards him in the past. Jack Smith is also requesting that the circuit judges above her, the appellate court above her, basically reverse her holding. We'll see what happens there. Donald Trump, of course, famously tried to weaponize the justice system against his political opponents. He called for the prosecution of Hillary Clinton when he was a presidential candidate in 2016. Lock her up, lock her up. He celebrated it. When he was the president of the United States, he tried to have her prosecuted. His DOJ would not cooperate, presumably because there was nothing there on which to prosecute her. He also publicly, as the president, just a few days, it was like, I think it was like a week or so in October prior to the election, publicly demanded repeatedly on Fox News that his attorney general, Bill Barr, prosecute Joe Biden, his political rival, and Barack Obama, a former president. So clearly Trump didn't believe in presidential immunity. Then he's an unprincipled, hypocritical loser who should be relentlessly mocked. So all of this is just projection from Trump. There's no evidence, of course, that Vice President Harris or President Biden have any role to play in the prosecution against Trump. Trump is being prosecuted by a grand jury of his peers and a special counsel who is appointed for independence from Merrick Garland, the attorney general, who in turn is quasi-independent from the Biden administration. So just all sorts of ridiculousness there. Now, let's get to some of the commentary, the legal commentary from legal experts about the superseding indictment. Barb McQuaid, legal expert, says, despite Trump's complaints, superseding indictment was obtained out of an abundance of fairness to him. Jack Smith's spokesman says, pared down indictment was presented to a new grand jury to ensure charging body was not tainted by any evidence deemed immune by SCOTUS. So they went out of their way to be fair to him. Speaking of Barb McQuaid, she and Glenn Kirshner, another former prosecutor, were on MSNBC, and this is what they had to say.
Did you expect a superseding indictment from Jack Smith at this time?
No, I really didn't, Katie, because what I thought he would do is just pare down the indictment, filing an amended indictment to comply with the court's order. You know, obviously the court had said the scheme relating to the Justice Department was official conduct and had to come out because a prosecutor can remove language from an indictment without going back to the grand jury. But if you change any of the allegations and put any new material in, you must go back to a grand jury and have them return that indictment. And so here, as you point out, they've really reframed the case, even though not much is different. Instead, the very first words of this are not Donald Trump was the 45th president of the United States, but it now says Donald Trump was a candidate for president in 2020. And it frames it in all of these instances as a candidate for office as opposed to a president engaging in official conduct. And so throughout the indictment, you will see not only the removal of some of these allegations about the Justice Department, but the addition of some language now to reframe it. In another example, Mike Pence is described as the vice president, but also as the president of the Senate who has the power to certify the election. And so those kinds of things require that.
So just on that note, because you might be thinking, well, why the hell would they phrase Vice President Mike Pence's role differently? Well, if you remember, in Trump v. United States, the disastrous Supreme Court ruling that I mentioned in the intro, one of the things that the Supreme Court under Justice Roberts said was that, you know, the correspondence between a president and his vice president is subject to presumptive immunity. So it's not deemed absolutely immune, right? It's not totally outside the realm of possibility for you to probe that and to use it as evidence in a criminal indictment. It's just very, very difficult because it's presumptively immune. We'll get to that in a second. But the reason it's presumptively immune, but not certainly absolutely immune, is because the vice president of the United States has dual functions. He is the second in command, the second highest ranking officer in the executive branch, but he's also technically, according to the Constitution, the president of the Senate. So he has a foot in both worlds. He has, even though the day-to-day he tends to be more a creature of the executive branch, constitutionally, he has one foot in the executive and one in the legislative. And given that that's you could argue that it's a member of the executive branch interfacing with a member of the legislative branch, you could potentially probe those communications and those actions to make a criminal case if you think the president broke the law. That's the distinction. So that's why Barb McQuaid mentions that Jack Smith went out of his way to emphasize the vice president's role as president of the Senate. You might be also thinking, what the hell does that, why does that even matter? Why is any of this absolutely immune? That's my position. But that is, for whatever reason, that is the distinction that the majority on the Supreme Court made, that basically within the executive branch, the president is untouchable. He can deal with his, and we'll get to this in just a second, but he can, he can order sham investigations. He can issue unseemly orders. He can do all kinds of things because he, as commander in chief, as head of state, head of government, dealing with the Department of Justice and the military, these things that belong to the executive branch, that's a core constitutional function. But if the president's interfacing with other branches, not so much. That's the distinction that they drew. I also want to play a clip from Ty Cobb, who used to be an attorney for Donald Trump, and I think until Trump left office, if I remember correctly. So quite recently, he also weighed in on the superseding indictments and Jack Smith's reconstruction of the case against Donald Trump.
Under which Smith has the authority to make this indictment. Did he do it? Does this indictment make a clean-cut case that the acts were personal?
I think it does. I think, some of the editing that you highlighted in your intro is spot on, emphasizing the private nature of many of these acts, the private funding of the speech at the before the Capitol intrusion, Pence's ceremonial role, the non-governmental roles of the co-conspirators, which they can now say categorically, and now that Jeffrey Clark is out, because he was the only government official who was actually in the original indictment. He's no longer in this indictment. So all the co-conspirators were acting in their private capacity. I think this threads the needle. If I'm Trump's lawyers, and I'm surprised, I'm scratching my head at that, because this was the reasonable approach to take. You no reason to go through a series of hearings before Judge Chutkan and force the task of editing the indictment on her.
So what Ty Cobb is also making the case is not only did Jack Smith expertly, shape this new case within the ridiculous contours, again, created by the United States Supreme Court, but he actually did it preemptively. So much of this was remanded back to Judge Chutkan that in theory, Jack Smith could have spent a lot of time, perhaps not wasted it. I think a lot of people would consider it a waste, and just say, okay, can I do this? Can I do that? Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I do this? And instead, he just preemptively pared it down to the best of his ability to basically try to preempt any sort of challenge that Trump's attorneys could offer and say, hey, this violates the Supreme Court's holding in Trump v. United States. So it also suggests a serious confidence about the case that he's making. So we'll see what happens. Obviously, there's no way that this is going to be decided prior to the election. But this is devastating legal news, which clearly has Trump triggered. And that is something in which we should take enormous delight. And in the meantime, you let me know what you think in the comments.